Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the most misunderstood civilizations in human history, ancient Rome. The empire of legions, emperors, marble statues, dramatic betrayals, and at least one man who allegedly fiddled while everything burned. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Let's begin with the most dramatic lie of them all. Two gladiators enter the arena. The crowd roars, sand flies, one man falls. The emperor tilts his thumb with the casual energy of someone rating a restaurant on a food app. Death every time. Except no. If gladiator combat worked like that, Rome would have run out of gladiators by Thursday. Here's the part Hollywood tends to skip. Gladiators were expensive, painfully expensive. They were trained in professional schools, called ludi, fed high-protein diets, given structured workouts, and treated by doctors who specialized in sports injuries. Yes, sports injuries. Because gladiators were closer to professional athletes than disposable cannon fodder. Training one could take years. That means food, housing, trainers, equipment, and medical care. You don't invest that much time and money into someone just to eliminate them after one afternoon performance. That's not spectacle. That's financial self-sabotage. Most fights were carefully arranged to maximize drama. Heavily armored fighter versus quick and agile opponent, shield versus net, strength versus speed. It was choreography with real risk, not random chaos. And here's something else people forget. The goal was suspense. The possibility of death is thrilling. Guaranteed death less so. After the 10th guaranteed execution, even Romans would start checking their sundials. Many bouts ended when a gladiator raised a finger in surrender. The crowd reacted loudly. The sponsor of the games made the call. And despite popular imagination, survival was common. Why? Because repeat performers build hype. Gladiators had fan followings. Their names were scratched into walls in Pompeii like ancient celebrity graffiti. Women admired them. Some became wildly popular. You don't develop a fan base if you're constantly deceased. Now, were there executions? Absolutely. Were some matches fatal? Yes. The arena was dangerous, but it wasn't a guaranteed death sentence every time. Someone stepped into the sand. Rome loved violence. It also loved profit, and nothing ruins a profitable franchise like killing off the entire cast after episode 1. The arena wasn't just about blood. It was about drama. And drama works best when the hero might live to fight again. Now, let's address the gesture that refuses to die. The emperor sits. The defeated gladiator kneels. The crowd waits. A thumb slowly turns downward. Execution. At least that's how movies tell it. The problem is we do not actually have clear evidence that a downward thumb meant death and an upward thumb meant mercy. In fact, it may have been the opposite. Ancient Roman sources use phrases like polyverso, which translates roughly to with a turned thumb. That's it. Not thumbs down, not pointing at the floor, just turned. Helpful. Some scholars believe that a thumb extended outward symbolized a drawn sword, meaning kill. A closed fist with a thumb tucked inside may have represented a sheathed sword, meaning spare him. So the dramatic downward thumb we all recognize might not even have been the signal. It could have been the ancient equivalent of a historical mistranslation that spiraled out of control. And honestly, that tracks. The confusion largely comes from a 19th century painting by Jean-Léon Gérôme titled Polurso. In it, Roman spectators dramatically point their thumbs downward, demanding blood. The painting was powerful. It shaped popular imagination. Hollywood saw it and said, "Perfect. We'll take that." But paintings are not primary sources. They are interpretations. In reality, decisions about a gladiator's fate were more complex. The sponsor of the games, often a politician seeking public approval, made the final call. The crowd influenced the decision, shouting, gesturing, waving cloths. It was less like a silent emperor judging from above and more like a loud, chaotic public referendum, which feels very Roman. The arena was political theater as much as entertainment. Sparing a skilled fighter could earn goodwill. Executing a coward might satisfy the crowd, but it wasn't a simple up or down switch. It was noisy. It was emotional. It was messy, just like Rome itself. So, the next time you picture that slow-motion thumb descending dramatically, remember history isn't always cinematic. Sometimes it's just ambiguous. And sometimes an entire myth survives because one painter in the 1800s made a really compelling choice. Ah, yes. The famous Roman dinner strategy. Eat, recline, discuss politics, stand up. Visit the vomitorium. Return refreshed, continue eating. It sounds scandalous, excessive, perfectly Roman. It is also wrong. The word vomitorium has absolutely nothing to do with vomiting at dinner parties. A vomitorium was an architectural feature in large Roman buildings like amphitheaters and theaters. It was a passageway that allowed crowds to exit quickly, to be spewed forth into the streets. Spewed forth, as in people moving efficiently, not senators purging oysters between courses. The confusion likely started because the word sounds dramatic and frankly a little gross. It fits neatly into the stereotype of Rome as endlessly decadent and morally unhinged. And yes, elite Roman banquets could be extravagant. Wealthy hosts competed to impress guests with exotic foods. Peacock dormice, elaborate seafood displays. Reclining on couches while servants refilled wine was very much a thing. Did some people overindulge? Absolutely. Were there individuals who purged themselves after overeating? Probably. Humans have been inventing questionable dietary solutions for centuries. But the idea that Roman architecture included designated vomiting rooms for formal dinner etiquette is pure myth. Imagine building a luxury dining hall and intentionally including a labeled purge corridor between the appetizers and dessert. That's not cultural sophistication. That's logistical chaos. Most Romans, by the way, were not attending elite banquets at all. The majority were working-class citizens eating simple meals of bread, olives, porridge, vegetables, maybe some fish or meat if they were fortunate. The image of constant marble feasts represents a tiny slice of society. But the myth survives because it reinforces the idea that Rome was constantly spiraling in excess. It fits the narrative of decline, of moral rot, of inevitable collapse. Reality is less theatrical. Rome had wealth. It had indulgence. It had excess. But it also had practical architecture designed for crowd control. And sometimes a word that sounds outrageous is just a hallway. History can be dramatic. It doesn't usually require a scheduled vomiting intermission to make its point. Few images are as iconic as this one. Rome is in flames. Citizens are screaming. The sky glows red. And Emperor Nero stands on a balcony calmly playing a violin while the Capitol collapses. It's dramatic. It's poetic. It's almost certainly not true. First problem, violins did not exist in the 1st century. That alone complicates the image. Second problem, according to several ancient sources, Nero was not even in Rome when the Great Fire began in 64 CE. He was in Antium, a coastal town, and reportedly rushed back to the city once news reached him. Now, was Nero controversial? Absolutely. Was he fond of performing music and poetry in public? Very much so. Did many Romans find that behavior undignified for an emperor? Yes. But the specific image of him serenitating a burning city appears to have developed later, especially in hostile historical accounts, and that's important. Much of what we know about Nero comes from writers like Tacitus and Suetonius, men writing after his death during regimes that had every incentive to paint him in the worst possible light. History is often written by the winners, and Nero did not win. Now, did he potentially benefit from the fire? That's where things get interesting. After the blaze, Nero built his extravagant Domus Aurea, the Golden House, a massive palace complex that included gardens, artificial lakes, and lavish decorations. It did not help his public relations. In fact, many Romans suspected he may have had something to do with the fire itself. Proof, none conclusive. Suspicion plenty. To deflect blame, Nero famously targeted Christians, accusing them of starting the fire and launching persecutions against them. So, was he innocent? Hard to say. Was he musically accompanying the apocalypse? Highly unlikely. The fiddling story survives because it perfectly symbolizes indifference, a ruler disconnected from suffering. It's memorable. It's sharp. It's easy to retell. But history is rarely that neat. Nero may have been vain, dramatic, and politically reckless. But the image of him calmly performing while Rome burned is more literary metaphor than documented fact. Sometimes legends stick because they feel right, not because they are. If you close your eyes and picture ancient Rome, you probably see a city full of men dramatically wrapped in white sheets, strolling through marble streets like they're permanently late for a Senate meeting. That's the toga. Myth. The toga was not everyday wear. It was formal attire, heavy, layered, and spectacularly impractical. A toga was made of wool, draped in a complex arrangement that required practice to wear correctly. It could weigh several kilograms. It restricted movement. It was not something you threw on casually to go buy bread. Imagine trying to farm, build roads, or chase someone through the forum while wrapped in a carefully folded woolen curtain. Exactly. Most Roman men wore tunics in daily life. Simple, functional garments suited. For work and movement, soldiers wore armor. Laborers wore sturdy clothing appropriate for their tasks. Even senators only wore togas during official duties. The toga was a symbol. It represented citizenship and status. Only Roman male citizens had the right to wear certain types of togas. There were variations. The toga virilis for adult men. The toga pretext with a purple border for magistrates and elite youth. It was political clothing, ceremonial clothing, not casual street wear. And it was hot. Rome is not a mild climate. Walking around Mediterranean streets wrapped in thick wool was not a lifestyle choice most people would make voluntarily unless social expectations required it. There are even historical complaints about how uncomfortable and inconvenient the toga was, which is strangely relatable. Fashion over function is not a modern invention. Now, here's the interesting part. Because the toga was associated with citizenship, wearing one became a statement of identity. It distinguished Romans from foreigners. It projected dignity and authority. So when we imagine all Romans constantly in togas, we are accidentally projecting a symbolic garment into everyday life. It's like assuming modern people wear tuxedos to the grocery store because tuxedos represent formal status. Rome loved symbolism, but it also loved practicality, and practicality usually won on workdays. So, no, ancient Rome was not a city of permanent sheet enthusiasts. It was a city of tunics with occasional dramatic wool. Let's clear this one up carefully, because this myth quietly reshapes how people understand Roman history. Julius Caesar was not an emperor. He was dictator perpetual, dictator for life. That title alone is dramatic enough. It does not need upgrading. When most people think of Rome, they imagine emperors ruling with absolute power. Golden laurel wreaths, marble busts staring into eternity. That system began after Caesar. Before him, Rome was technically a republic. It had senators, magistrates, elections, and a complicated web of power sharing that was designed, at least in theory, to prevent one man from taking total control. Now, in practice, that system had been under stress for decades. Political violence was increasing. Powerful generals were building personal armies loyal to themselves rather than the state. Enter Caesar. He was a brilliant general, a master of propaganda, and very aware of his popularity. After conquering Gaul and marching his army across the Rubicon, which was legally speaking not something you were supposed to do, he plunged Rome into civil war. He won, and then he accumulated power, not as emperor, but as dictator for life. That distinction matters because emperor implies a formal recognized system of imperial rule. Caesar never ruled under that title. He pushed the republic to its breaking point. And then in 44 BC, he was assassinated by senators who believed they were saving the republic from tyranny. Spoiler, they did not. Instead of restoring the old system, the assassination triggered more civil wars. Eventually, Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian, emerged victorious. Octavian became Augustus. Augustus became the first true Roman emperor. So, ironically, killing Caesar did not stop one-man rule. It cleared the path for a more stable, permanent version of it. History has a dry sense of humor. The men who stabbed Caesar believed they were ending a dictatorship. They accidentally helped invent an empire. So no, Julius Caesar was not emperor. He was the bridge between republic and empire, which might actually be more historically important and arguably more complicated than simply handing him a crown he never officially wore. If you ask most people when Rome fell, they'll confidently say 476. One date, one collapse, curtain closed. It sounds clean, final, cinematic. Unfortunately, history rarely behaves that neatly. The year 476 marks the deposition of Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire. A Germanic leader named Odoacer removed him from power. That moment is often labeled the fall of Rome. But by that point, Rome had been unraveling for generations. Political instability had become routine. Emperors rose and fell with alarming speed. Some ruled for months. Some barely had time to unpack their armor. Civil wars drained resources. Rival clans battled for legitimacy. Meanwhile, the empire's borders were under constant pressure. Germanic tribes moved into Roman territory, sometimes as invaders, sometimes as federated allies who were supposed to defend the empire, but occasionally decided to renegotiate the arrangement with swords. The economy struggled. Tax systems faltered. Military recruitment became more difficult. Maintaining a massive empire required enormous administrative effort and constant revenue. It was less a sudden explosion and more a slow structural crack spreading through marble. And here's the part people forget. The Eastern Roman Empire did not fall in 476. It continued for nearly 1,000 more years. Centered in Constantinople, the Eastern Empire, which we call the Byzantine Empire, preserved Roman law, culture, and administrative systems long after the West fragmented. So Rome did not collapse in a single fiery moment. The western half fractured gradually, transforming into various kingdoms ruled by former Roman officials and Germanic leaders who often adopted Roman customs. Roman law barbarians. So the idea that Romans were perpetually intoxicated is exaggerated. Now, were there infamous figures known for excess? Of course. Emperors like Caligula and Commodus developed reputations for extravagance and instability. Certain aristocrats hosted lavish feasts that pushed the boundaries of taste. But extreme examples are memorable precisely because they were extreme. If every Roman lived in permanent chaos, it would not have been worth commenting on. What sustained Rome for centuries was not decadence. It was administration, infrastructure, trade networks, military organization, law. You cannot govern vast territories while permanently hung over. Well, not effectively. The myth of constant Roman excess survives because it fits a moral narrative that Rome collapsed because it became too indulgent. It's a convenient story, but civilizations are more complicated than that. Rome was flawed. It was ambitious. It was brutal at times, but it was also disciplined enough to maintain order across continents. And that doesn't happen if everyone is permanently reclining with a goblet. There's a certain image burned into popular imagination. A wall of shields, perfect. Formation, red cloaks flowing, the Roman legion advancing like a human machine that simply does not lose. And, to be fair, Roman soldiers were extremely effective. But invincible? Not even close. The Roman military machine was disciplined, organized, and innovative. Legions trained rigorously. They built roads as they marched. They constructed fortified camps every single night. They adapted tactics based on terrain and enemy strategy. But they also suffered catastrophic defeats. One of the most famous disasters occurred in 9 CE in the Teutoburg Forest. 3 Roman legions marched into what they thought was friendly territory under the guidance of a local leader named Arminius. He betrayed them in dense forest. Roman formations collapsed. Heavy armor became a liability. Ambush tactics overwhelmed the legions. By the end, tens of thousands were dead. The Roman Empire never fully expanded into Germania after that. Invincible armies do not suffer humiliations like that. There were other setbacks, too. Legions were defeated by Parthian cavalry at Carrhae. Civil wars drained manpower. Internal rivalries sometimes caused more damage than external enemies. Rome's strength was not perfection. It was recovery. After disasters, they rebuilt. They reformed tactics. They recruited new soldiers. They learned from mistakes. The Roman army evolved over centuries. From maniple formations to cohort systems, from citizen militias to professional standing forces. And even at its peak, Roman military dominance depended heavily on logistics, alliances, and political stability. When internal corruption or economic strain weakened the system, the army's effectiveness declined. So no, Roman soldiers were not mythic superheroes who never lost. They were highly trained professionals in a powerful military structure that sometimes failed spectacularly. What made Rome formidable was not that it never fell. It was that it could stand back up again, and again until eventually it couldn't. Invincibility is a legend. Resilience is history. And Rome had resilience in abundance for a very long time. For some reason, a persistent image exists of Romans trudging through sewage-filled streets covered in grime, never having discovered the concept of soap. That image is misplaced. Romans were, by ancient standards, impressively clean. Public baths were everywhere, not just in Rome itself, but throughout the empire. Large bath complexes included hot rooms, warm rooms, cold plunges, exercise courtyards, and social spaces. Bathing was not a rare luxury for the ultra-wealthy. It was a regular part of urban life. For a small fee, citizens could enter and spend hours moving between heated rooms, scraping oil from their skin with a tool called a strittle, socializing, discussing politics, or negotiating business deals. Yes, baths were social hubs. Think gym, spa, networking lounge, and public forum all combined, except with more steam and fewer motivational posters. And then there were aqueducts. Massive engineering projects carried fresh water into cities from distant sources. Some Roman cities had running fountains in public squares. Sewage systems like the Cloaca Maxima drained waste away from populated areas. Were they perfectly sanitary by modern standards? No. They did not understand germ theory. Bath water was shared. Soap was not used in the way we use it today. But compared to many other ancient societies, Roman infrastructure was advanced. The stereotype of universal filth likely comes from later periods in European history when bathing habits changed and urban sanitation declined. Influenced medieval Europe. Roman roads were still used. Roman identity persisted in different forms. The idea that Rome fell overnight is appealing because it offers a clear ending. But the reality is more complex. Rome did not die. It changed. It adapted. It fragmented. It evolved into something else. Empires rarely vanish in a single scene. They erode. And sometimes they linger far longer than the date in your textbook suggests. If movies are your primary source, ancient Rome looked like one endless rooftop party. Marble villas, reclining couches, grapes being casually hand-fed, wine flowing like a broken aqueduct, senators discussing politics between bites of peacock. And yes, that version of Rome did exist for. Ironically, medieval cities often had fewer public bathing facilities than ancient Rome. The Romans valued appearance. Cleanliness was tied to social status and public respectability. A well-groomed citizen signaled discipline and order. Of course, not everyone had equal access. Rural populations lived differently from urban elites. Slums existed. Poverty existed. But the idea that Romans simply wallowed in dirt is misleading. They invested heavily in water systems and public hygiene spaces. You do not build massive aqueduct networks if you have no interest in staying clean. So no, Rome was not a giant open sewer. It was a complex urban civilization that in many ways understood the importance of washing up better than some eras that followed it, which is not something people expect to hear. There's a tendency to picture Roman society in extremes. On one side, senators draped in luxury dining beneath painted ceilings. On the other, enslaved laborers chained to OES or fields. While both of those realities existed, they do not capture the full picture. Rome was not a two-layer cake. It was a layered, complicated social structure with multiple levels in between. Yes, slavery was widespread. Enslaved people worked in households, mines, farms, workshops, and administrative offices. It was a brutal system that powered much of the Roman economy. But beyond slavery and the aristocracy, there was an entire middle world. Merchants ran shops in crowded streets. Artisans crafted pottery, tools, jewelry. Bakers operated ovens that supplied daily bread. Teachers instructed children in rhetoric and literature. Doctors practiced medicine. Lawyers argued cases. Contractors built houses and repaired roads. These were free citizens and freedmen navigating economic opportunity. Freedmen, formerly enslaved individuals who had been granted freedom, could become remarkably successful. Some amassed significant wealth, particularly in trade and business. Though social stigma lingered, economic mobility was not impossible. Rome had bankers, real estate investors, shipping, magnates, bureaucrats managing taxes and records. That does not sound like a society divided strictly between marble palaces and chains. Of course, inequality was severe. The elite controlled immense land holdings and political power. Poverty in crowded urban districts could be harsh and unstable. But the majority of Romans occupied the middle spaces. They paid taxes. They worked trades. They married, raised families, worried about prices in the marketplace. In other words, they lived ordinary lives. We often compress Rome into spectacle, wealth, and brutality because those extremes are dramatic. But what sustained the empire for centuries was not just aristocratic ambition or forced labor. It was the daily routine of millions of people participating in a functioning economy. Civilizations do not endure on spectacle alone. They endure on shopkeepers, builders, teachers, and administrators. Rome was not simply a tale of decadence and oppression. It was also a society of workers navigating a vast and sometimes unforgiving world. And that complexity is far less flashy than marble banquets, but far more accurate. If you imagine ancient Romans walking around sincerely believing that every emperor was a glowing divine being sent directly from the heavens, let's slow that down a bit. The reality is complicated. Yes, emperor worship existed. Yes, some emperors were officially declared divine after death, a process known as apotheosis. Statues were erected, temples were dedicated, coins were minted with divine titles. But that does not mean every Roman citizen genuinely believed the emperor was a walking thunderbolt. Religion in Rome was practical. Ritual mattered more than personal belief. Participation in state ceremonies showed loyalty. Offering incense at an imperial altar was as much political signaling as spiritual conviction. It was civic religion, not blind worship. In fact, the title Deus, meaning divine, was usually granted after an emperor's death by the Senate. Augustus, the first emperor, was deified. Posthumously, that created a tradition. But living emperors calling themselves gods, that often caused discomfort. When certain rulers like Caligula or Domitian leaned heavily into divine self-presentation while alive, it raised eyebrows. Some Romans viewed that behavior as arrogant or unstable. There was a difference between honoring the emperor's authority and believing he personally controlled lightning. Also, emperor worship varied by region. In the eastern provinces, ruler cults had already existed under Hellenistic kingdoms. So honoring a living ruler as divine was more culturally familiar. In Rome itself, it was more restrained. Political loyalty and religious symbolism blurred together. Declaring an emperor divine reinforced legitimacy. It unified provinces under a common symbolic authority. It was propaganda as much as piety. And Romans were very good at propaganda. Most citizens likely approached emperor worship pragmatically, participate in rituals, show respect, avoid trouble. Whether they privately believed in literal divinity is another matter. Rome's religious world was layered. People worshipped traditional gods Jupiter, Mars, Venus, alongside local deities and later foreign cults. Adding a deified emperor to the mix was not revolutionary. It was administrative. So no, Rome was not a society of wide-eyed believers worshipping every emperor as a celestial being. It was a society that understood symbolism, power, and public performance. And sometimes the line between religion and politics was intentionally blurry, not unlike certain eras closer to home. We already dismantled the idea that gladiators died every single fight. Now, let's tackle the next assumption. Every gladiator was a chained, unwilling victim forced into the arena. Many were enslaved. That part is true. Prisoners of war, condemned criminals, and enslaved individuals made up a significant portion of the gladiator population. But not all of them. Some gladiators were volunteers. Yes, volunteers. Free Roman citizens, sometimes even from respectable backgrounds, who signed contracts to fight in the arena. These men were called alurati. They agreed to train and compete for a set period of time, often in exchange for money, debt relief, or the promise of fame, which raises an uncomfortable truth. The arena was not only a place of punishment. It was also a career path, a dangerous one, obviously. But for men buried in debt or chasing recognition, the gladiator life offered something rare: visibility. And Rome loved visibility. Gladiators were celebrities. Their names appeared in graffiti. Women admired them. Children likely played at being their favorite fighters. Winning consistently brought prestige and financial reward. Some even became wealthy. Others earned freedom after years of service, symbolized by receiving a wooden sword called the rudis, a formal retirement. It's also important to remember that gladiator schools were not chaotic torture pits. They were structured institutions with training regimes, diet plans, and medical staff. Again, because trained fighters were valuable investments, that does not make the system humane. The arena was brutal. Injuries were common. Death was always a possibility. But the simplistic image of every gladiator as a helpless victim misses the complexity of Roman society. Some were forced, some were desperate, some were ambitious, and some were drawn by the same force that fills stadiums today: the promise of fame. It's easy to reduce gladiators to a symbol of cruelty. It's harder to acknowledge that some walked into the arena willingly, knowing the risks, because Rome offered few other ways to transform your status overnight. The arena was not just punishment. It was opportunity. Terrifying opportunity, which somehow makes it even more Roman. If you picture Roman women as permanently silent figures standing in the background of marble halls while men made all the decisions, you're only seeing half the story. The Senate or assemblies. On paper, their power was limited. In practice, not so simple. Elite Roman women wielded enormous influence behind the scenes. They managed vast households, controlled significant wealth, arranged marriages that shaped political alliances, and advised powerful men who listened very carefully. Take Livia, the wife of Augustus. She had no official title that gave her governing authority. Yet, ancient sources suggest she influenced court politics for decades. Her network of allies and her proximity to the emperor made her one of the most powerful figures in early imperial Rome. Agrena the Younger, mother of Nero, maneuvered herself into the center of imperial politics with remarkable precision. Messalina, wife of Claudius, became infamous for her manipulation of court dynamics. Were these women controversial? Absolutely. But controversy does not equal powerlessness. Roman women could own property. They could inherit wealth. Some ran businesses. Wealthy widows, in particular, had considerable financial independence. Inscriptions and legal documents show women acting as patrons, funding buildings, supporting public works, and sponsoring religious festivals. Even in everyday life, women shaped family strategy. Marriages were political tools. Producing heirs was critical to maintaining status. Social reputation often depended heavily on a woman's management of the household. And remember, influence does not always require a title. Politics in Rome was deeply personal. Networks mattered. Relationships mattered. Access mattered. Women operated within those networks effectively. That does not mean Roman society was equal. It wasn't. But the idea that Roman women were, legally speaking, Roman women could not vote. They could not hold political office. They were excluded from formal participation in. Entirely powerless shadows ignores the subtle ways authority functioned in that world. Power in Rome did not always sit in the Senate chamber. Sometimes it stood quietly behind it, and sometimes it whispered in the emperor's ear, which historically speaking can be far more effective than voting. And now we arrive at the grand moral lesson people love to attach to Rome. The empire fell because it became decadent, lazy, corrupt, too obsessed with pleasure, too morally rotten to survive. It's a satisfying explanation, simple, clean, judgmental, and deeply incomplete. Every civilization has corruption. Every society has moral debates. Rome was no exception. There were power struggles, excess among elites, political betrayals, and spectacular scandals. But empires do not collapse simply because someone threw too many dinner parties. The decline of the Western Roman Empire involved complex economic pressures, military overextension, administrative fragmentation, and demographic changes. Border defenses grew harder to maintain. Recruitment became more difficult. Tax systems strained under pressure. Political instability weakened internal cohesion. Competing generals fought civil wars that drained resources. Barbarian groups were sometimes integrated as allies and sometimes turned against the empire when agreements broke down. Trade networks shifted. Inflation rose. Agricultural output fluctuated. Plagues reduced population. This was not a morality play. It was structural stress over centuries. Blaming Rome's fall on decadence alone is convenient because it turns history into a warning story. See, luxury leads to ruin. But reality is less poetic. The Eastern Roman Empire continued for nearly 1,000 years after the West fragmented. If decadence alone destroyed Rome, why did one half survive so long? Because collapse is rarely caused by a single vice. It's usually caused by overlapping pressures that slowly erode stability. And here's the ironic part. Rome endured for centuries precisely because it adapted repeatedly. It restructured its military. It reformed its administration. It extended citizenship. It absorbed foreign influences. The empire did not collapse the first time it faced corruption or luxury. It endured them. So the idea that Rome fell simply because it became morally weak oversimplifies a civilization that lasted longer than most nations ever will. History is not a sermon. It's a web of causes. And Rome's story is far more complicated than a cautionary tale about too much wine and marble. Sometimes the truth is less dramatic, but far more interesting. Before Rome ever called her Augusta, before legions saluted her name, Julia Domina was a child of the East. She was born in the wealthy Syrian city of Isa, a place where desert light met temple gold and where religion and politics were inseparable. Her family were not obscure provincials. They were the hereditary high priests of the sun god Elgabal, custodians of a sacred black stone believed to hold divine power. Authority, ritual, and influence surrounded her from birth. Unlike many Roman aristocratic girls raised primarily for marriage alliances, Julia grew up in an intellectually vibrant environment. Syria in the 2nd century was a crossroads of empire, a place where Greek philosophy, Roman administration, and Eastern mysticism blended into something uniquely powerful. She was educated. She listened to scholars. She absorbed rhetoric and argument. She understood how ideas could shape men and how men shaped history. An astrologer once predicted that she would marry a king. In the ancient world, such predictions were not dismissed as harmless superstition. They were political signals. Word of the prophecy reached a rising Roman commander, Septimius Cis. He was ambitious, sharp-minded, and recently widowed. He also happened to believe deeply in omens. When Cis encountered Julia, he saw more than a beautiful Syrian noble woman. He saw poise, intelligence, a presence that did not shrink in conversation. Their marriage was not simply romantic. It was strategic. Around the year 187, Julia left Isa and entered the beating heart of Roman power. Rome was overwhelming. Marble temples towered over crowded streets. Senators whispered in shaded porticos. Generals calculated their next move behind polite smiles. Julia did not retreat into ornamental silence. She watched carefully. She learned the unspoken language of influence. She understood quickly that Rome's stability was an illusion maintained by loyalty to the army. When civil war erupted after the assassination of Emperor Commodus, Severus moved decisively. In the chaos of competing claimants, he marched on Rome and seized power. Julia stood beside him as he claimed the imperial title. The prophecy had ripened into reality. She was no longer merely a priest's daughter from Syria. She was Augusta, Empress of Rome. And this was only the beginning. The moment Septimius seized power, Rome did not suddenly become peaceful. It became tense, fragile, dangerous. 3 different men had claimed the throne in the chaos following Commodus's death, and Zeus had defeated them one by one. But victory in Rome was never permanent. It had to be defended constantly. Julia Donner understood this immediately. Unlike earlier empresses who remained in Rome as decorative symbols of stability, Julia traveled with her husband on campaign. She accompanied him to the eastern provinces when he marched against Pineus Niger. She later endured the cold brutality of the northern frontiers during the Parthian Wars. This was not ceremonial tourism. These were harsh military operations. Disease, mud, exhaustion, and constant threat followed the imperial court. Her presence among the troops was not accidental. Zeus needed legitimacy. He was African by birth, ruling a traditionally Italian elite. Julia was Syrian. Together, they represented a new kind of imperial household, one that reflected the broader empire rather than just Rome itself. But that diversity also made traditional senators uneasy. Julia did not allow suspicion to weaken her. She cultivated relationships within the army. Soldiers saw her in their camps. They heard of her intelligence and calm demeanor. Soon she was given a rare and powerful title, Mater Castu, Mother of the Camp. It was more than symbolism. It suggested protection, unity, and continuity in an empire held together by military loyalty. While Zeus fought on the battlefield, Julia often managed communication networks, corresponded with officials, and advised on political matters. She understood that wars were won not only by swords, but by stability at the center. She became a quiet but firm presence in decision-making. In Rome, meanwhile, the Senate watched carefully. A Syrian empress traveling with the army, influencing imperial decisions and commanding respect among generals was unprecedented. Rumors began as they always did. Some accused her of overstepping. Others whispered about ambition. But Julia had learned something early. Power in Rome was never handed gently. It was navigated carefully, defended strategically, and maintained through intelligence. As Severus consolidated his rule, one thing became clear. This was no passive imperial consort. Julia Donner was not simply standing beside the throne. She was helping to hold it upright as Septimus Severus secured his rule. Julia Donner stepped into a role even more powerful than empress. She became the mother of the future. Her 2 sons, Caracalla and Gator, were not just children of privilege. They were heirs to an empire held together by force, loyalty, and fear. Julia understood the stakes from an early age. She shaped their education carefully. They were trained in rhetoric, philosophy, and military discipline. Tutors were chosen not merely for knowledge, but for loyalty. She wanted her sons to command respect, not only with swords, but with intellect. Rome had grown tired of foolish emperors. Stability required competence. Yet beneath the polished image of unity, tension was growing. Caracalla and Getter were opposites. Caracalla was intense, suspicious, easily angered. He admired Alexander the Great and longed for military glory. Getter was quieter, more measured, more inclined toward administration. Their rivalry did not remain a childhood squabble. It hardened with age. Julia tried to balance them. In public ceremonies, she presented an image of harmony. Coins were minted showing the imperial family together, father, mother, and two heirs. The message was clear: continuity, stability, dynasty. But inside the palace, competition simmered. Cease, practical, and ruthless attempted to prepare them both for joint rule. Before his death in Britain in the year 2011, he reportedly advised them to be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all other men. It was simple advice. It was also impossible. When Cease died, Caracalla and Gator became co-emperors. Julia now found herself in an even more precarious position. She was no longer simply supporting a strong husband. She stood between two powerful young men who distrusted each other deeply. The empire watched closely. The army sensed weakness. Julia attempted mediation. She arranged meetings. She encouraged cooperation. She tried to keep Rome from splitting into factions aligned with each brother. But resentment had grown too deep. The palace itself became divided. Servants took sides. Guards whispered. Proposals emerged to physically divide the empire between East and West. For Julia, this was the ultimate test. She had helped build a dynasty. Now she had to prevent it from tearing itself apart. And she was running out of time. The breaking point came not on a battlefield, but inside the imperial palace. After months of bitter tension, Caracalla proposed a reconciliation meeting with his brother Gaeta. It would take place in their mother's apartments. Neutral ground, no weapons, only family. Julia agreed, believing, perhaps desperately, that maternal presence could cool political hatred. It was a fatal miscalculation. As Gator entered her chambers, assassins loyal to Caracalla rushed in. Steel flashed. Panic erupted. Gator ran toward his mother, seeking protection, calling out for help. He was cut down in her arms. Blood spilled across the floor of the Empress's private rooms. Julia held her dying son as soldiers finished their work. Caracalla had chosen absolute power. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Gator's supporters were hunted down across the empire. Senators, officials, servants, anyone suspected of loyalty to the slain emperor faced execution. Ancient sources speak of thousands killed in the purge. The city of Rome itself trembled under the weight of fear, and Julia remained. Her position was now more complicated than ever. She had lost a son violently at the hands of her other son. Yet she could not publicly mourn him. To do so would challenge Caracalla's legitimacy and possibly cost her life. Gator's name was erased from inscriptions. His statues were destroyed. His memory was condemned. Damnatio memoriale, condemnation of. Memory turned a living man into an official non-existence. For Julia, this was not political theory. It was personal devastation disguised as composure. Yet she did not withdraw from public life. Instead, she leaned further into governance. Caracalla, increasingly paranoid and focused on military campaigns, relied heavily on his mother for administration. She supervised correspondence. She reviewed petitions. She became a stabilizing presence in a court dominated by suspicion. Her strength during this period was extraordinary. She had witnessed fratricide. She had endured the erasure of her son's existence. And still she continued to function as the intellectual and administrative center of the regime. Caracalla's rule grew harsher. He granted Roman citizenship broadly through the Constitutio Antoniniana, partly to increase tax revenue. He pursued military glory obsessively. He demanded loyalty without question. Behind the scenes, Julia worked constantly to preserve order. The empire had survived civil war. It had survived palace murder. Now it survived on the resilience of a grieving mother who refused to collapse. If the palace had become a place of blood and suspicion, Julia Donner transformed another space into something entirely different, a sanctuary of thought. While Caracalla chased military glory across the provinces, obsessed with Alexander the Great and the image of invincible conquest, Julia remained the intellectual axis of the empire. In Rome and later in Antioch, she gathered philosophers, rhetoricians, jurists, and scholars around her. Her court became something rare in a time of fear, a living salon of ideas. This was not casual entertainment. It was deliberate cultural leadership. Among those drawn to her circle was Philostratus, whom she encouraged to write the life of Apollonius of Tyana, a work blending philosophy, mysticism, and political subtlety. She supported jurists whose legal interpretations would shape Roman law for generations. She engaged with thinkers who debated ethics, governance, and the nature of virtue in a crumbling political climate. In a world ruled increasingly by the sword, Julia elevated the mind. Her Eastern background played a role. Raised in Syria, where Greek philosophy mingled easily with religious mysticism, she was comfortable navigating multiple intellectual traditions. She did not see philosophy as detached theory. She saw it as a stabilizing force. Ideas properly cultivated could lend legitimacy to power. Caracalla's regime needed that legitimacy. His rule was feared but not universally loved. The massacre following Getter's death had damaged the dynasty's image among elites. Julia's cultivated circle softened that perception. It suggested refinement, learning, continuity with Rome's intellectual heritage. She was in effect reshaping imperial identity. Even as Caracalla hardened into suspicion and severity, Julia projected composure and rationality. Petitioners approached her. Governors corresponded with her. Legal matters crossed her desk. She became a bridge between the emperor's will and the empire's administrative reality. Yet, this intellectual brightness existed under constant tension. Caracalla trusted few people. Conspiracies were real, and some were imagined. Surveillance was constant. Fear lingered in corridors. Still, in the midst of that anxiety, Julia's court radiated a final glow of classical Roman culture, a reminder of an empire built not only by legions, but by law, literature, and philosophy. For a brief moment in a violent age, her salon became the last steady flame of reason in a gathering darkness. Caracalla's reign grew heavier with each passing year. His obsession with military glory intensified. He styled himself as a new Alexander, imitating Macedonian dress, surrounding himself with soldiers and pushing eastward toward Parthia. The empire became a marching camp. Julia followed. She was no stranger to travel by now. From Britain's cold winds to Syria's deserts, she had seen the edges of Roman power. But this phase felt different. Caracalla's rule was not guided by careful consolidation like his father's. It was driven by image, fear, and relentless movement. He trusted the army more than the Senate. He trusted force more than persuasion. Behind the spectacle, Julia worked continuously. She handled administrative burdens while her son chased conquest. Correspondence flowed through her office. Provincial complaints reached her ears. Financial strain grew as campaigns drained the treasury. The Constitutio Antoniniana had granted citizenship broadly, but it had also reshaped taxation and bureaucracy. The machinery of empire required constant maintenance. Julia understood something Caracalla did not always acknowledge. Rome was not sustained by dramatic gestures. It was sustained by paperwork, law, and negotiation. Yet even her influence had limits. Caracalla's paranoia deepened. Executions continued. Officers rose and fell with unsettling speed. The emperor's inner circle narrowed to men he believed unconditionally loyal. Among them was the Taurian prefect Macrinus. In the year 217, while traveling near Carrhae in Mesopotamia, Caracalla stopped along the road. He stepped aside briefly, unguarded for a moment that should have been insignificant. An assassin struck. The emperor fell, killed, not in glorious battle, but in a sudden and ordinary betrayal. The army reacted quickly. Macrinus maneuvered swiftly and declared himself emperor. He had not been born to imperial blood. He was an equestrian, an administrator, now elevated by opportunity and necessity. Julia, at that moment, in Antioch, received the news. Her last surviving son was dead. The dynasty she had built was shattered. The Sever line appeared finished. But even then, she did not immediately surrender to despair. Macrinus understood her influence. The Eastern legions respected her. The administrative elite knew her competence. He could not simply eliminate her without risking instability. For the first time in decades, Julia stood at the edge of power without a son or husband to anchor her position. The empire had entered a new uncertainty, and she had to decide whether to fight for relevance or let history close around her. Caracalla's death did not immediately remove Julia from influence. In fact, for a brief moment, she remained indispensable. Macrinus, now emperor, lacked legitimacy. He was not of senatorial rank, not of imperial blood, and not beloved by the army. He needed stability in the east, and Julia Donner was the embodiment of that stability. For years, she had governed from Antioch while campaigns raged. Governors respected her. Soldiers recognized her presence. Even rivals understood her political intelligence. Macrinus initially treated her with caution rather than hostility. He allowed her to remain in Antioch and even continue certain administrative functions. But the balance was fragile. Julia had no living son to defend. Her authority rested entirely on reputation. And reputation is powerful until it becomes threatening. Macrinus soon realized that as long as Julia lived and commanded loyalty in the eastern provinces, she represented a potential center of opposition. The Severon dynasty still had supporters. Whispers traveled through military camps. The idea of restoring Severan blood to the throne was not unthinkable. Julia herself was not naive. She understood the shift immediately. The tone of correspondence changed. Access narrowed. Influence diminished. She had spent decades navigating civil wars, assassinations, and palace intrigue. She could read political temperature like a seasoned general reads a battlefield. At the same time, her body was failing her. Ancient sources suggest she suffered from illness, possibly cancer. Years of stress, travel, and emotional trauma had taken their toll. She had endured the murder of one son by another. She had watched the second son grow into tyranny and then die violently. She had held the empire together while it cracked beneath ambition and fear. Now she faced a final humiliation, irrelevance. Macrinus eventually ordered her to leave Antioch and return to Rome. It was framed as protocol, but the message was clear. She was no longer necessary. She was no longer central. For a woman who had once been Marta Castrum, mother of the camp, intellectual patron of the empire, and political strategist at the highest level, this dismissal was not simply political. It was existential. Julia Donner had built her life around power, stability, and dynasty. Without those, she was left with only memory. And in Rome, memory could be as dangerous as ambition. When Julia Donner understood that her political life was over, she did not collapse in panic. She calculated. Macrinus had stripped her of influence and ordered her return to Rome. The journey itself would have been symbolic, a public demotion from imperial architect to sidelined widow. She had spent decades shaping emperors and advising generals. To be paraded back as a relic of a fallen dynasty was a humiliation she would not accept. At the same time, her health was deteriorating rapidly. Ancient accounts suggest she was suffering from a severe illness, possibly cancer. The pain was constant. The body that had traveled